hopefully you can see this properly. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. This is going to be really a two-part series that we'll be going through. The next one for next month is the follow-up really about interviewing. Um, these are some things that and I won't spend a lot of time, some of you know me, some of you don't, but my background, not just as a PM, but I have a fairly substantial amount of experience career-wise in terms of recruiting and hiring for my teams. And so I had an opportunity to put some content together for another effort in the Agile community recently, who also has been experiencing a lot of lost Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, et cetera. And a lot of the principles are the same. So these are my tactical but functional suggestions to get started with if you are looking for a role, whether you're not working now or whether you want to level up from where you are, you have concerns. I think there's a lot of things that are happening in the overall job market that are impacting a number of us. So with that, the Extreme Makeover PMI Project Manager's Resume Edition. We'll go through this. I'm going to go through some of these slides a little bit quicker than I would normally because I've added some content on generative AI that I think is really important for folks. And if you aren't using those tools, I'll give you some immediate things that you can apply to get started that I think will be really helpful in your journey. So our agenda and desired outcome, why does a good resume matter? Remembering our audiences, some positive patterns to consider, and then some suggested next steps and some additional resources. We're doing all of this so that we want to properly present ourselves in the best light to organizations where we want to work through our improved resume, throughout all the technology and everything else in terms of tools and applications and things like that. Resumes still are the way that a large number of us get our positions, and even if it is initiated through something online, or if you've just got a networking sort of connection, a resume is really a pivotal artifact that we use to succinctly and clearly tell people who we are in a way that aligns to, if we're doing it well, what they're looking for within their organization. So with that, why does it matter if my resume is a bit imperfect? One of my favorite images, by the way. So if you ever see this owl with its head like that, you will find that I use it in a lot of my PowerPoints. But there's some data about why we really need to focus on the quality and content of our resume. I found some data. This goes back not too long. Career Builder survey in 2018. Reasons why hiring managers and recruiting team members identified in declining to move forward with even interviewing a candidate. This is what we're talking about. This is why we're here. And again, just based on some of my experience as a hiring manager, if I see some of these things on a resume, it's hard to, that whole idea, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, is really true. And things that folks don't always think about. Typos or bad grammar. 77% of the respondents in the survey didn't proceed based on things that, again, a lot of us would think, well, yeah, that's embarrassing. But it shouldn't stop me from being considered. The reality is, in a lot of cases, especially today when people are looking at hundreds of resumes, there's just too much competition to have these sorts of mistakes. Unprofessional email address, that one is really surprising. We'll talk about some examples of that. You can only imagine, but I've seen some of those, especially for more entry level or associate team members, folks who are just coming out of college in many cases, but not uniquely to that group. So something that, it's not difficult to get a email address that is professional, that aligns to what one would expect. But a lot of people don't do that, and they get kicked out, 35% in this survey. Resume without quantifiable results, and we'll talk more about what that is. But 34%, so just over a third of them were kicked out because they didn't quantify the results, and they may well have had those results, but they weren't on the resume, which means they didn't even get an interview. I'm guilty of at least a few of these, or I have been. Resume with long paragraphs of text. I'm sort of verbose. Those of you who've been in meetings with me know that is true. We don't want to continue that, certainly with our resume. Long paragraphs of text are just very difficult for the brain to process, and you just check out. Resume being generic and not customized to the company. I've been guilty of this in prior lives as well. Um, it really, again, these days, if you're, I'll talk more about this on some of the subsequent slides, but many of us are qualified to do more than one role, or the role at a particular company may be very specific. If you don't customize it, almost 20%, so almost 1 in 5 got kicked out just for that. Resume more than 2 pages, 17%. That one I've had to work on as well. Some of you may have to. I've been doing this for a long time, but I've had to pare my resume down. Some of you may have to do that as well. It's just too much to read, even if it's all good stuff. No cover letter with resume. I am not a fan of having to generate cover letters, but again, if the customer or prospective employer where we want to work requires that, even if it feels antiquated, if they require it and we don't provide it, that's 10%. So before we start working on making any changes, for me, this is always paramount. And some of you may already think this way, but if you don't, it's a good reminder. Who is our audience? And so when we're generating a resume, it's, if it's my resume, I'm not the audience. I'm not the customer. I'm the provider. Resumes are a little bit weird, though, in the fact that as PMs, we already focus on knowing who our customer is and providing value. I like to think of it through that same lens and apply that same principle. Who are we serving on a particular initiative? In this initiative, it's actually our project, or our resume for this particular project. So who is our audience for our resume? Is it an automated process? So these days, almost every resume is going to go through some level of automated processing. Is that our customer? Is it a recruiter? Some companies have internal recruiters. Some people go through third parties. If it's going directly through the company, or even if it does go through a recruiter first, does it go through a company's human resources associate? Does it go to the position's hiring manager? How about peer members on the team, senior managers? Where this is something where we have a bit of a balancing act, is the answer for a resume is all of the above. We need to generate a resume that hits all of the right notes, but we need to be thinking about all of these individuals. If we're sending a resume, for example, thinking that the reviewer is going to be the manager, the hiring manager on the team, in all of my prior lives, I was never the first person who received a resume, and a lot of them never got to me because the HR department and or a recruiter filtered a lot of them out first. So if you're designing it only for somebody who is highly technical or who is highly experienced in project management, you might be using terms, acronyms. You're talking about a PMO, maybe an entry level human resources analyst or associate. They may not even know what some of those terms mean. So we have to be really thoughtful. And it's difficult, but it's doable to make sure that our resume is hitting all of those right notes, that it has the right level of specificity, but it also has readability for these other systems and these other individuals who may not have that depth, in many cases will not have that depth of experience or background. We always want to be focused and thoughtful, and it's a balancing act. You really just, again, what I'll cover today, there's a lot of different things that you want to be looking at, and you'll want to balance them because all of these folks, if you ultimately proceed to the point where you're meeting with the team and doing an interview with the team and leadership, you're going to have to be able to speak to all of these people through one single artifact. So some things that I have found to be successful as far as positive resume patterns. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, by the way. So the first is to be focused over generalized. The second is outcomes over activity, meaningful metrics over superlative words. And those of you who may be thinking I'm using a superlative word to talk about superlative words, yes, that's intentional. And it's silly, but it does actually act as a good reminder about who are we trying to impress when we use those words. Clarity over excessive jargon and acronyms. Again, back to that prior slide, not everyone's going to know what all of your expertise and your acronyms mean as an expert project or program manager. So be thoughtful about how we use those jargons and acronyms. Honesty and misrepresentation, honesty over misrepresentation and exaggeration. professional over personal, and then polished and presentable over rushed and inconsistent. So these will be 7 elements that we'll be talking about um, as we proceed through the rest of this conversation. So the first is focused over generalized. Um, Many of you, I imagine, and certainly myself as included, the Johnny Cash song, good, bad, or otherwise, I've been everywhere, man, right? So many of us have held and are qualified for various roles. That's great. But a generic resume is easy for us to create and update. I personally have been guilty of this one as well as a few other ones on this list. The problem is most, if not all, roles that you will be submitting to are going to be for a very specific role. And even if you have those elements on your generic resume, you're going to have a lot of other stuff that is going to compete for visual and mental attention if you have that generalist Swiss Army knife kind of resume. So we'll talk more about how to generate different versions based on specific roles, but you want to really have, at least at the role level, you want to have a very specific focus. So in this particular one, manage technical tasks for the company's most important systems. I really want to be very focused on what this is in terms of provided 24/7, 365 support for over 10,000 users internationally. I've provided very specific details about what I've done. Managed technical tasks to me might be completely different than what somebody else thinks about as far as managing technical tasks. So this allows someone to understand with specificity what I did. You can also see the metrics that are really important and what those outcomes were. So wherever you have them, not only be specific, rather over general information, but wherever possible in your specifics and your focus area, provide metrics or any kind of outcomes. Not everything is measurable by numbers, but things can be concretely observable. This thing was done. We did implement this particular thing. So the more specific and focused and concrete you can be, the better. Outcomes over activity. So as represented on the prior slide as well, hiring managers, anybody who would be bringing you onto their team, they'll want to know about what the outcomes were for the work that you did. So managing a project is something that you do, but what was the outcome from that particular project, the impact of that? That will set you apart from many other candidates simply by talking about what you did and what it accomplished. So in this example, trained employees on using Scrum. In that same example, if I trained employees on using Scrum, I'm still talking about what I did, but I transitioned 3 core teams. So I've specified a number of teams that actually were part of this training. I talk specifically again about what those outcomes were: 22% lower defects and 31% improvement in overall cycle time. In the efforts that you do as far as the projects that you are implementing, especially if you can articulate things that you specifically have been part of that success in delivering that particular outcome. If you have taken a problematic project and you've gotten it back on track, that kind of outcome detail, how you took a project that was failing, for the last 18 months, and you were able then to bring that project back in with the next 3 months and deliver with a revised budget and scope, whatever the case may be. The more specific you can be as far as those outcomes, the more compelling you're going to be as a candidate for a hiring manager. Meaningful metrics over superlative words. So expressing what you've done as far as the impact and outcomes is really important. And so it's great to be thinking about dramatically increasing or greatly reducing things. But again, wherever you can, this metrics idea is more and more expected these days with hiring managers and HR managers, HR associates, is when we're talking about even greatly increasing volume and revenue here, what does that mean? My version of greatly increasing volume and revenue, as opposed to yours, could be completely different. It doesn't tell the full story. And a good hiring manager, a good HR manager is going to want to see something again like this. And again, you can see this also is another example of how we talk about outcomes. So using words like greatly, best, those sorts of things, we want to move away from that verbiage, even if that idea is really important, something to be proud of. In this particular instance, this is actually, I think, a real item from my resume from back in the day, but oversaw the development of the company's first online ordering application, increasing new business. And I don't just say increased new business, increased volume, increased revenue, increased new business by 23% and revenue by 12%. And then when you're talking about those meaningful metrics here, the acronym for year over year, but if you're going to provide those sorts of meaningful metrics, always ensure that you're talking about what the time frame is. If I increase things and I improve efficiency by 10%, if I'm looking at your resume and you say I've improved something by 10% and you don't tell me if you did that in a month, a year, or 10 years, it's still a metric, but without knowing when that was done, it becomes far less useful and meaningful to me because I have no idea how much time it took to actually accomplish that. Clarity over excessive jargon and acronyms. So those of us, especially those of us who manage technical projects, doesn't have to just be software though. In any area where you have any sort of technology or depth of a really specific technical specialty or any area of specialty, again, back to that first slide about who our audience is, people in HR departments aren't going to necessarily understand what those acronyms are or what the jargon is. So this is especially bad in technology where we use a lot of TLAs. The first time I heard that acronym, what's a TLA? A three-letter acronym. So we even have a TLA for our TLAs, which I thought was a little bit ironic. But when we think about our customers, we want to think about inclusive language. We want anybody who reads this to be able to understand the main elements of it. It's as a bit of an aside for folks who are posting positions that I've seen on places like LinkedIn. It's very surprising to me in the job description, they often talk about roles where they mention proprietary applications that they have or acronyms. That's the flip side of this problem here, really, in the expectation that anyone would know what those things mean who might be applying to them. So think about this as you're reviewing your resume. If we're using things, so those of you who are involved with software development projects, these terms may be quite familiar to you, but I used ASP.NET, Microsoft SQL Server, and C# to build an app that will connect to real AC. How do I make that language more inclusive so that anybody who doesn't have the understanding of, oh, hey, that's the Microsoft stack in terms of technologies for development, database, and programming languages. I'm still telling that same story, but I leveraged Microsoft technologies to integrate the company's appraisal, order placement, and tracking capabilities. And again, in each one of these, you can see that I'm also still including things that we've talked about prior because I want to be able to articulate in language that anybody who's reading this should be able to understand. Any layperson who's reading this after, leverage Microsoft. Well, everybody knows who Microsoft is. They can understand what an appraisal order placement system is in most cases. They know what tracking capabilities are. And then again, I've got that impact statement there. So I'm still talking about the same thing that I did before on the left, but I'm talking about it now in language that's going to be clear and compelling to anybody who looks at my resume. This next one, thankfully, I don't think I've done, at least if I have, it's been decades, but I hope that I've never really done this. But I still see a lot of instances where this happens. And as you saw on that first slide about the career builder data, please, and I don't think any of you would do this, I hope that you wouldn't, but I would just say for anybody who is sort of stretching the truth, or in some cases I've had people who are just outright not telling the truth about things that are on your resume. you'll get caught sooner or later. There's really no upside to it. It's unethical, but it's damaging to everybody involved. It's damaging to your reputation. But it still happens commonly enough that I included in this conversation. So this is an extreme example. I don't have any any other examples that I could think of, but single-handedly designed, developed, tested, deployed, and supported the company's most successful app, resulting in 2,000% user growth month over month. I haven't had anything this bad, but I have certainly had resumes where people talked about um, an effort that they took complete responsibility for developing and delivering, that could not rationally be justified in terms of one individual being able to do all of those things and to have that sort of an impact. So it was misleading at best, and it was dishonest at worst. All of us have things that we concretely can point to if we think about it as we're refining our resume, that we can point to and to be proud of, that are good exemplars and representatives of who we are and what we bring to the table, what we bring to that role. Let's focus on doing a good job at that. So, a more realistic one that again could be compelling to a hiring manager and to an HR manager is led the development of the recommendation engine of the company's first mobile app, organically growing the user base to over 500 users in the first 3 months. That's a much more modest but accurate representation of what was done. It still speaks to outcomes. It still speaks to specific elements of what I did in terms of my contribution here. And there's something to be proud of here, and there's something that a hiring manager could say, this is somebody who brings some good skills to the table based on that. And it's something that's true, and that's something also, by the way, where this people normally get into trouble. If it doesn't get caught in the resume review process, I can basically guarantee that any good hiring manager, unfortunately, this happened a lot to me as somebody who was reviewing resumes. They weren't this extreme in terms of the before type examples. But when you get into an interview, if you put something like that on your resume, I've had to explicitly say this in at least 2 or 3 interviews over the last decade or so. I would ask people about specific items on their resume, and then they would sort of start walking back what their contribution was, if at all. So I led something to, I was involved in it, to I was part of that organizational unit, those sorts of things. It's a really embarrassing and time wasting effort for everyone involved. So even if your resume, if you put those things in there and it gets you past the point where you get the interview, when you have the interview, any good interviewer is going to ask you about the items that were compelling to them. And they're going to ask you specifics about what you did and how you measured it. They're going to ask you experiential based questions. We'll talk more about that in the July session, but that's something that I do, and all of my leaders did the same thing, was to use a specific example and ask experiential based questions. So you can't Google those answers in advance. You can't prepare for them, maybe for the first one, but the follow on questions are going to be based on things that actually happened. You can't fake that, and you shouldn't. So the best thing is to just talk about the things that you have done, quantify them, be proud of them, and be prepared to talk about them, but don't misrepresent or exaggerate them. Professional over personal. Now, again, this may not be as big of an issue for those of you who are attending, who are career professionals. I imagine virtually all of you for quite some time. That said, in some instances, for some resumes that I've received, it wasn't just people who were coming right out of college for a year or two. It is pervasive in sort of that particular entry level-ish type role, but it happens far more commonly than I would expect, to the point that, again, it showed up in the Career Builder survey and shows up here as well. So I don't think I ever had the baddest ninja penguin, but I've had things that are almost as bad as that in resumes. If that's your Gmail address, on a day that is not an interview day, I'd love to talk with you about why you are the baddest ninja penguin and what that even means. But if I'm looking at your resume and if I see anything that looks unprofessional in the email address, what it's going to tell me is that as a hiring manager, either you don't understand professionalism is important for an organization, or you don't care enough about that you would create another email address that would be appropriate for use for your resumes. Whatever it is, what it's telegraphing about you in that context, there's nothing good that's going to come from that. So here was another one. These are extreme examples, but I've had other things, and there's some mixed thoughts as far as hobbies and activities. I will leave that to each of you to decide if that's something that you think is a net negative or a net positive for you. What I would say is that if you include things like hobbies or activities, I would strongly encourage them to be things that are related to at least your industry or potentially things that you're passionate about. But just also be very careful. This is unfortunately the universe in general, from my perspective, is a very highly politicized climate. Um, Even things for certain nonprofits, telling people what your hobbies may be in those instances. I don't know what the upside is in some cases, but there definitely can be some downside if you're involved in a particular, whether it's progressive or conservative or whatever flavor that might be. You don't know who's going to get your resume. And unless it's something that is relevant to the role or who you are as a person at your core, that you want to be associated with the professional work that you do, I think there's a lot more risk than reward in putting those things on your resume. So um, on the right, you can see my example. And so you can see that I included a well, my standard J Halberstadt boring email address, but I do include not hobbies or activities, but my volunteer work. Um, and I'm proud to do the volunteer work that I do, which is why I put it on here. So VP of Professional Development for PMI, Northern Nevada. I'm proud of that work. It also is relevant to the work that I do if I'm looking for work in a new role. Board member and technology support for Meals on Wheels. I was on the board for the Meals on Wheels organization in Spokane, Washington. Um, I don't see that there's any downside to that. I don't. If anyone as an organization is really antagonistic about free or low cost meals for seniors, I probably wouldn't want to work there anyway. But I'm also showing that I'm using my professional skills applied to a nonprofit organization that has a mission that I believe in. So again, this is going to be something that's a very personal decision for you to decide how much of that is something that you want to include on your resume. I would just say, if it's not at least tangentially related to the work that you do or the work that you want to do, at least ask yourself, what do I want to get out of having this on my resume? In some cases, there is value there, but that's really something that, if nothing else, I would just say be thoughtful and considerate about that. Polished and presentable over rushed and inconsistent. Back in the day, again, I'm dating myself. Back in the old day when I first started sending out resumes, and some of you may be in the same boat. We went down to Office Depot or some similar place, and we actually bought some heavy paper stock, and it was expensive. When we bought nice envelopes, and we had our laser printed everything, etc. And things are so much easier to generate now. There's templates in every application that generates documents for resumes and cover letters and things like that. It makes it really easy to get started and to create things, and the ability to post things via LinkedIn, the ability to send things via email or through other online systems. It makes it really easy to generate these artifacts and to actually send them out. And we need sometimes really to slow down and look at, again, that first slide about grammar, the 2018 Career Builder Survey, the things like grammar and punctuation. I personally, embarrassingly, have been guilty of that, and I have to have a peer review of my resume and look at it multiple times to make sure that I've got, for example, consistent periods in there. It's easy, especially if you have a lot of history and especially if you're revising a resume that you've had for a while, to lose sight of that. But it looks very unprofessional. So here's another extreme example. Please don't use Comic Sans on your resume. But in this particular example, you can see even in this instance, I have 3 or 4 different fonts that I'm using, different font sizes. it's really difficult even visually to look at that, different colors, different punctuation, etc. We want some level of ease of reading. Visual design, again, some of the tools that exist today make it a lot easier, whether you're using Word or Google Docs or anything else, for these templates to do a lot of the formatting for you. But the right as compared to the left, it's just so much easier to read. It's so much more professional looking. It telegraphs who I am as a person, and I want that to, again, it's part of that first impression, like it or not, conscious or otherwise. If somebody got my resume and it looked anything like the thing on the left, I don't know that they would even read further than the header. So make sure that you're thinking about that. And I think I have this in my recommendations on the subsequent slides, but always do a peer review. It's really important from my perspective, at least for me, even if you're using other tools, to have another human being take a look at it. Somebody who understands your industry and who knows you is a really good way. And I will also, just for anybody who wants that review, I'll throw this out in the LinkedIn group as well. If anyone would like me to take a look at their resume as just another review, if you don't have anybody who you can have take a look at that, feel free to send me an email with your resume, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to do that. And I imagine I'll volunteer some of my other PMI board members that I think might be interested in helping out as well. But if anyone has that need, if you don't have somebody that you're comfortable with sharing with that, be happy to do that for anybody who might find that valuable. So I mentioned that a lot of this content was for a session that I did recently. It wasn't actually that recently. I think it was about a year ago, maybe a little bit less. The world has certainly changed dramatically with generative AI. And yes, there's a ridiculous amount of hype. That said, I find that these tools, this is one of the most exceptionally good uses for these tools. There are, by the way, a number of generative AI tools. Teal.ai specifically is the one that I've heard good things about and took a brief look at. I can't speak to how good it is, so that would be something, though, that you could check out. But without going into a specific resume-focused tool, generative AI, with whatever flavor of that you prefer to use, can be incredibly helpful with a lot of what we just talked about. Maybe not formatting just yet, but with everything else. So I use ChatGPT, the paid version. I think the free version can do everything that I'll talk about. Claude, if you haven't used it, from Anthropic, I'm starting to be a big fan, and Perplexity is another one that you can check out if you don't have a chosen favorite as of yet. But with any of these tools, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, I haven't tried Gemini since the last couple of debacles with Google, but I imagine it could do that as well. Whatever your preferred Gen AI tool, though, is, it can help with implementing virtually everything that I have covered to date. One of the superpowers for these tools that really, from my perspective, has changed the universe is an area that I really struggled with when I was looking at my resume. And I think for those of you who may be in the same situation, and you have the ability, you've been qualified to do different things. So maybe you're a project manager now, but you also, maybe you're an exceptional product manager, or maybe you're a functional manager of a certain type, or maybe you're a software engineer. If you've got that kind of experience and you've got a generic resume and you need to have at least a minimum of a role specific resume, these tools are incredible for being able to take your current resume and to, with the direction that you can provide through prompting, generate a specific version of your resume focused on those specific roles. So it is the fastest way I have seen to actually generate each instance of that resume based on a specific role. So those of you who haven't tried these tools, it's definitely, I highly recommend it if you have that kind of a background where you may be applying for a product manager role, a project manager role, maybe a director type role for a particular area. Whatever those things may be, use your same resume as a starting point and throw them into these systems, whichever you prefer. with prompts with that context. I'll talk about that in the subsequent slides about what role you're looking for, and let it take the first crack at generating that for you. In my tests on this, I found that it would explicitly take certain bullet points out that I had that were not relevant for another position. So that is one of the superpowers of these tools, if you have that sort of diversity in terms of the types of roles that you're looking for and applying to. Some other things where generative AI can really help that I've found, especially some of the fairly recent updates, I think, to ChatGPT 4.0, is the ability to reference postings and public job postings. Not only can you use these tools to take your resume and make them role specific, but you can point these tools at publicly available posts to have a version specifically directed or oriented towards that position, and also get more information on that company. So same thing with cover letters. I'm not a fan of them, but if somebody requires them for the job, if you're applying for a job and it requires one, use those tools to generate a specific cover letter for that specific opportunity, based on the context of also what's in your resume. Since these generative AI tools keep the context in the same thread or in that same chat, remember, if you're not familiar with generative AI, this is something that you can get up to speed on, I think, pretty quickly. But one of the magical powers, from my perspective, is what it can do with context. So if it knows that I'm working on a resume, and then my next prompt after that specific resume for that specific role is a cover letter, it'll retain that context in generating that cover letter about who I am from my resume and the information about that specific role. It'll generate a wonderful cover letter based on pulling data in from those different sources. That is a highly customized, targeted cover letter specifically for that opportunity. And then finally, if you, beyond just having generative AI tools help with your resume and your cover letter and making them role specific, if you're applying for a role, now again, don't put it on your resume if you're not qualified to do it, but if you're applying for a role or you're interested in applying for a role, but you need some additional training, you can also, again, with that same context, if you're pointing it towards a specific role that's publicly posted, you can ask it to suggest some specific available learning opportunities that it could be aware of online, that you could go through that training to get you up to speed. If you're missing a particular requirement, if that's something that could be acquired through training and education, or if you just want to get up to speed on something, have terminology, those sorts of things, use in that same chat, in that same thread, specifics that you want as far as for training or learning options for that particular role. So here's a couple of real world screen caps. These, I was using ChatGPT 4.0, and in this particular one, they just cracked open a new chat in ChatGPT. And if you're not familiar with generative AI prompting, there's different conversations. I've got some stuff online that I'm happy to share with you, but there's a lot of great resources that probably are better than what I provide. But I'm happy to point you towards the training that I've done on generative AI tools and how to use effective prompts. But if you're not familiar with this, even if you've been using these tools, the prompts are really the thing that you want to focus on. And when you focus on the prompts, the more context, the better the output is going to be. So in this particular instance, you can see in my example, I'm a project manager who is looking for a new role. I have lots of, again, I don't just say refine my resume for being a project manager. I'm a project manager. I'm looking for a new role. That context matters. I have lots of experience in software. I spelled technical wrong. That's embarrassing, but true. I have experience in software and technical operations projects, and I prefer roles that are for agile ways of working. Refine my resume to be as ATS, applicant tracking system friendly, and aligned to the roles like the above. I understand that that is grammatically an awful sentence, but for the prompt, it actually works just fine. I think that it is really helpful to include, if you're using these tools, the reference specifically about being ATS friendly, applicant tracking systems. I don't know what the data is at this point in terms of how many resume submissions go through this, but I thought that it was getting well over 70% the last time that I looked. Whatever that number is, it's a big number. And so we want to make sure that when we're having our resume refined by these tools and otherwise, that we want to make sure that, back to our knowing our customer in this case, the first customer for a lot of us that we need to satisfy is that applicant tracking system. So that's a really good thing. If you don't want to have to think about how to do that, use ChatGPT or whatever tool you're using to include that. And again, notice how I finished that awful run-on sentence, aligned to the roles like the above, because again, I'm fairly adept and comfortable in agile ways of working. I prefer them. I would like to orient the language on my resume. Again, I'm not changing what those details are, but how I present that information. I want to orient it towards agile-based project management and program management. So here's another example, and I tried to find something that was local to Reno for project managers, and I was not overly successful, but this was the best that I could find within a very brief Google search or two for a public posting of a job that was available online that I could point it towards. But I had mentioned earlier about the idea of how you can now start using publicly accessible links. So what you can see is my prompt here. So you can't see the text that predated this or precipitated this, but when I type this in, so this is you can start your whole chat conversation based on this, or you can do it from one of those other threads that we talked about on the prior screen. You can keep that context going if it's appropriate in this context. And so I say, refine my resume based on this job, and I point, as long as it's publicly available. It can't be behind VPN or any sort of firewall or whatever. But if it's a publicly posted link, and even for LinkedIn, you generally can follow these and get to the organization site. I pointed it specifically at a online job posting. And obviously I have no well, maybe not obviously. I have no background in slots or slot project coordinators. My background is not really in project coordination at all. But just by putting in refine my resume based on this job and pointed it towards that publicly available link, it did some searching and it gave me this intro here, refine your resume. So it actually found from what that posting was that it was the slot project coordinator position. And then it goes through and it has done, and I didn't have enough space to put the entirety of the resume there, but it generated a refined version of my existing resume. It didn't create a template or anything like that. It took my resume and it oriented the content of that refined resume specifically for this role. And that's something that you can do again for anything that's publicly available. So if you really want to stand out from other candidates, the more specific that you can be to align exactly what is in their job posting and the requirements that are there to what you've done, the more likely your resume is going to stand out in a good way from the rest. So some suggested near-term next steps, and then we've got a couple of minutes for questions if there are any. So leverage these positive patterns in reviewing and updating your resume. Again, you could start with ChatGPT or you can just start with a visual. I normally start with the existing copy and I find some things, and I do ChatGPT or other tools later, but you may want to do the inverse. As I'd mentioned, again, it's a lot easier these days with the tools that are available, but make sure at a minimum, even if you don't do specific posting level resumes, make sure that you have one resume per the role that you want, PM versus other PM versus Scrum Master versus BA. Limit the final to 2 pages. Prune back. These are real world examples of mine, although I did this about 10 years ago, but I found I had references to things like Windows XP, token ring networks that nobody uses anymore. So those are useless on a resume. They're actually a net negative because they don't really take into the account that nobody uses these technologies anymore. It seems sort of tone deaf. Use built-in or online grammatical review capabilities, especially if you're not using tools like ChatGPT, to make sure that you've got appropriate word choice, spelling, this thing with principal versus principal engineer is kind of terrifying because I've seen that from people's LinkedIn posts. Be very careful about, even if it's passing a spell check, make sure that it is the appropriate word for that context. Use these resume templates in most cases. Don't try to do the design on your own unless you're a designer, which I don't think any of you likely are to be if you're in a project manager's meeting. They do the heavy lifting for you, and so it's really important to have consistency in formatting. If you're not using a tool, and in some cases, even if you are, ask a family member, friend, or coworker to review for clarity, consistency, and formatting. Use these tools to start, ideate, brainstorm, or refine. Depending on what I'm using, in some cases, if I really want to start from scratch, I'll throw something into ChatGPT and say, hey, create me a resume for this particular role. In most cases, though, I've got a good starting point, or I have a starting point. I don't know if it's good. And then I will ask the tool to help refine it, again, based on those specifics that we talked about as far as those prompts. This one is always interesting for me, especially these days, and we're sort of in an interesting place with generative AI. As wonderful as they are, they have a challenge in often being confident and wrong. That's been my experience with a lot of AI, is that it's not really humble in terms of saying I don't know or I don't understand. So make sure that even if you're having it do the heavy lifting for you, take a cursory check at what that is, not just for hallucinations, but maybe it's not representing the data properly. These tools are all based on statistics. And so if you're doing something that's new or unique or different, it may water down or inaccurately present something when it does its refinement if it doesn't have enough data to reasonably be able to understand what you're talking about. And I'll provide these resources out later for everybody. I don't know if I can easily share them in the chat. We have just a little under 2 minutes. John Thompson. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can keep sharing without a PowerPoint. Go ahead.
Hey, John. I had a quick question as I'm looking to update my resume.
Yeah.
I was thinking as a template or way to kind of look at putting in my project management experience is look at the application I filled out for my PMP, because you really have to break down everything you did to disqualify. So I thought, would that be a good way to start to refine my current, resume to align more closely to, in general, as a starting point for project management jobs?
I think that is a brilliant idea. And what I might, um, I'd have to look at the categories again, David. I don't know if ways of working might be one. I think there's a professional development one. Forgive me for not remembering that off the top of my head. But I think there was a skills enhancement. But I need to take a look at the list, David, unless you've got it handy. But John, back to your question. I think that is a brilliant idea. My suggestion would be, thank you, that take that and copy paste, or if you had it in whatever format you've got, and I would actually, and you and I can do this for an exercise if you would like, put it into ChatGPT with the specifics on the prompt, with that context of where that came from, and that you would like it to generate a new resume for you, either based on the specific role that you can point it at, or as a senior project manager, whatever that might be, and let it generate it from you. If you've got the data in there, I think that would be something that you could do almost immediately. I'm tempted to actually do it right now, but I won't do it real time just because that there may be some other questions out there. But that would be my suggestion. I think it's a great place to start, and I think that is one instance where I would say absolutely using ChatGPT or similar tool would make that process incredibly quick and easy for you.
Okay, that's kind of what I was thinking as I'm looking for my first full-time remote job down the road, is just learning how to update it, and also maybe using ChatGPT to find those full-time remote positions.
Yeah, and and we can talk a little bit more and maybe do some follow-up from in the LinkedIn group. But yeah, it would be, let's John, maybe you and I can tag team on that. We can show everybody who was here what the results were if you're comfortable with that. Thank you. And then Chris, and then Jody afterwards. Chris, please.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, hey John, thank you for this presentation. great information, great examples. I'm curious how you, and this actually might tie back into John's question.
Yeah.
Curious how you view sites like LinkedIn and Indeed in terms of your background. So for me on my LinkedIn, I have essentially my master resume is on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
What are your views on the details for LinkedIn and Indeed versus a resume? Should LinkedIn have more content? What are your
Yeah.
views on
Yeah, thanks for the question. This actually came up recently, and in my feeble memory, I don't recall where, but it's come up in the last week or two. I'll give you my perspective. I would also say you may want to look for other perspectives because mine might be in the minority. For my personal background on LinkedIn, and I think I have a profile on LinkedIn, Indeed, I definitely have one on LinkedIn. For me, I don't see value in providing the details of what I did. I do talk about my role and my experience on my LinkedIn profile. Um, my perspective on that is, well, a couple of reasons. There may be some things that I don't want to share with the entire universe. I mean, LinkedIn is available for anyone to access anything. There's a lot of spammers out there. There's a lot of, it's not proprietary information, but it's information that I was trying to think of a good example that doesn't involve dating, but I mean, you don't necessarily want to share everything up front with the entirety of the universe. So whatever example that's not dating we can provide, but that would be like an example of if I'm going to have a profile out that anybody who has access to a browser and internet connection can look at. If they go to LinkedIn, I think it's great for them to know where I've worked, when I worked there, and what my role was. If they want to know the specific things, how many people reported to me, how much budgetary control I had, then we can have that conversation. But at that point, to me, I would be a little bit further along in the process. The resume to me is the tool to do that introduction. But again, other people may have different perspectives on that. For me, I scaled back the details in my profile on LinkedIn many years ago because I was only getting badness from that. There was no positive. There was, anybody who knew that I was the VP of this particular thing in a particular domain knew the company. That was a good enough information for them if they wanted to talk to me, if that made sense. Okay. Thank you, David. I'm sorry. Thank you, David, for that. Chris, I hope that answers it. I would just say again, caveat emptor, I've been a hiring manager for a long time, but there's different perspectives out there and there may be some compelling arguments otherwise. But for me, that's definitely, I have a strong opinion on that one.
Yeah, that's a good point. I appreciate it. I'll turn it over to Jody. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Jody, please.
Hi. Yeah, I have a kind of I don't know, it's a wider question, but related to chronological versus functional resumes.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious. It seems like, it's chronological to me is always the most easy, but in your research and in your experience, have you seen the functional work well?
I haven't, and again, I'll just tell you from my personal experience, and some of this is going to sound awful, but I think at least to get in the mind of a hiring manager, and I don't know that my perspective on this is unique. In some ways, I like functional better, but the first thing that when I look at a resume and it's functional, good, bad, or otherwise, the first thing I say is, why is this not chronological? What is wrong with somebody's history to the point that they have changed what is the standard accepted format? Now, again, there may be different schools of thought there, but because chronological has been the de facto standard for so long and for so many, the first thing that I look at, and unfortunately it normally bears true, is that when somebody uses the functional format, they're doing that to avoid, thank you, David. They're doing that because there's something else that's uncomfortable on their resume. And so now the thing that they're trying to avoid being seen is now the focal point. So I don't, in any individual context, that may not be the context for you, but normally there's big gaps, or that people have gone into a different industry for a period of time. When I see functional resumes, or they don't have the depth of experience that's required, so it's almost always a trigger for, or an indicator that there's something else that is potentially problematic for their ability for the role. And I would much rather just say chronologically. And if somebody hasn't worked for a while, that they keep it really simple. But a lot of people had that during COVID. They had to take care of people. That's a very reasonable excuse. Or not an excuse, I'm sorry, an explanation for why they weren't available. But if I see that missing, then I'm going to immediately say, what are you trying to hide? So that may not be for everybody, but I very rarely see functional resumes as far as the format and orientation. And when I do, every instance that I can think of off the top of my head, it was trying to sort of wallpaper over something else that they didn't want to see on the resume. Doesn't mean that the resume was bad, but again, the thing that they were trying to avoid me understanding, I immediately gravitated towards, and that became my focus. So with that, I think we are at time. Thank you all. If there's any other questions, please connect via LinkedIn, or you can use the PMI Northern Nevada LinkedIn group. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that this was helpful for some of you. And Greg's got his hand up. You got like 1 minute, buddy.